Great. Thanks for hanging around for the last event of the day, but certainly not the least. I'm Anima Anandkumar, not Amina. I get confused all the time, but thankfully it's the right spelling there. And so I wear two hats. I'm a professor at Caltech. I'm also director of machine learning research at NVIDIA. And so to me, research organization can come in many different forms, right? And along with me is Bharath Kadaba, who is SVP and Chief Innovation Officer at Intuit. And just backstage, we were having conversation on his journey through different organizations and what he believes should be the role of research in the commercial and in the industrial world, and how with the advent of AI, we are amidst this AI revolution, how the role of research organization is changing fast, and we have to adapt to this new world, this new frameworks of where innovation is so fast-paced, and there is the fear of missing out, but at the same time, there is the need to invest long-term and the need to invest in that foundations. How do you strike that right balance is what we hope to talk and get out of this session. So do you want to give a brief introduction and your journey?
Absolutely. Happy to do that. So great to be with you, Anima. Quick show of hands in the audience. I want to get a sense of how many of you are associated with larger enterprises and how many of you in early stage startups. So just want to get a sense of the audience here. If you could raise a hand if you're in the larger enterprise world like I am. That's about half. And how about early stage startups? Yeah. Excellent. So what we want to make sure is in the conversation, we don't want to just focus on large enterprises and the challenges that they have with respect to how do you compete effectively in the world of fast-paced technology changes, in particular AI. So that's important. But I also want to talk about in terms of how we run the so-called research organization. I want to relate that to startups because I think the startup mindset is really critical in terms of how we create projects and run projects. And I believe very strongly in that. So I want to make sure it's also useful to you all who are in early stage startups, trying to figure out what does AI mean to you, whether you're a startup who are actually doing something in AI, or you're actually trying to adopt AI in whatever products or service that you're creating. So I just want to make sure that the conversation is not relevant to only half the audience and the other one feels left out. So I just want to.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually a related question would be, how many of you are in companies where there is a research organization, something is designated as a research organization? Okay, only a few. Right, and maybe the very first question we should discuss is, do we need a research organization? If so, is it only in the big companies, or can startups also have a research org? And what would be that connection between research and products?
Yeah, the way I think about startups is they are a research organization. Why? Because the startups are taking that risk in terms of creating either a product or service that is expected to change the world. And that's the aspiration that every startup has. And therefore, that's a wonderful way of actually doing research where you're actually putting your career, your money behind something that you're building, which, as you know, in the larger enterprise, that's not the case. Typically, the larger enterprise that can actually think about a research organization is doing well enough to actually say that I'm going to devote some of the resources to do some of the advanced thinking, advanced innovation that's not happening in the rest of the company, or it's not happening at the scale that they would like to see. So that's sort of the way I think about that.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah, and that's a great point, right? Like, it's, I guess, one of risk management. If you already have a product that is running for a long time and you're only making small changes, then you're not taking risks. One of my professors would joke that if you've never missed a flight, that means you're arriving to the airport early. So, you need to miss some flights.
Exactly.
And so then I guess moving on to delving a bit deeper into this risk mitigation, what would be strategies within research to mitigate risks?
That's an excellent point because a few years back, that was a very good book that I recommend everybody read, which is Eric Ries's book on lean startup. Mm-hmm. And the big thing about that book was all around how to mitigate risk. Whether you're a startup or a large company, how do you mitigate your risk? In a small company, by the way, and I have been in 2 startups, so when I say that, it's from personal experience of actually being in a startup and trying to figure out what is the right product to build, and how do I make sure that customers are actually interested in the product. And that's a risky proposition. Mm-hmm. And there, it's all about figuring out how to keep the team lean, don't make it too large, make sure that you have the right people on the team, because when you have a small number of people, you cannot afford to make mistakes in terms of what is the makeup of the team. So you've got to have that deep craft expertise in the team and that conviction, and then you run fast. And that's in a fast iteration, try a lot of different things, and be willing to pivot. And the way that we say that in my company is don't fall in love with the solution that you have come up with, fall in love with the problem that you're trying to solve. And then iterate really fast and be willing to pivot. And that's what the Lean Startup book is all about in terms of risk mitigation. In a larger enterprise, the challenge is if the company is doing really well, and Intuit, by the way, is a company that's doing really, really well. And when that happens, there is that sense of, hey, our products are doing really well in the market. Let's continue to invest in the products the way that we're investing and continue to make incremental improvements. And I think that's where one can go wrong. And that's where you need this so-called research organization that is actually willing to take the risks. Mm-hmm. So my group is about 70 people out of 9,000 employees in the company, and the 70 people are hand-selected to be the natural risk takers, because they're not in a product group shipping a product, and they're not getting that satisfaction of I'm shipping something every day. These are the people who say, no, I don't want to do that. I actually want to think about the harder problems and take the risk of trying to solve them. And that's the profile of people that you need. And I also think about diversity, right? Whether you're a startup or a research team, I think about how do we make sure that the team is diverse, not just in gender, but also in terms of craft expertise. So in my group, for example, we have a bunch of design people, a bunch of product people, a bunch of engineers, and also data scientists. So it's a collection of diverse people. And I look at my design team and I say, I'm a computer scientist, and I look at the design person who leads my team and say, her brain works extremely differently than my brain. And that I need that diversity of thinking with respect to building anything at all. So that's kind of the way to think about risk mitigation.
I think that's a great point, right? Because diversity is what leads to the most creative teams. And I want to comment a bit on the NVIDIA experience. Many of you may not be aware that the CUDA framework, that's all the foundation for our GPU programming, started out as a research project. Right? And in fact, when that was introduced, apparently the stock went down because it was considered like so much investment on something that's risky. But again, it, I think, talks to the vision of our CEO, Jensen Huang, and the leadership to say, we'll take the risks because in the long term, it pays off. And same with ray tracing. It started as a research project. And then, but at the same time, having that runway, we published in conferences and then taking that to product, right? Giving that, I think, bandwidth and runway is super critical because there's also the risk of taking the research too early into product, and that's bad for the research team because now you're trying to make it into a product that's not yet ready, or goes into the marketplace could also have adverse effects. There is this fail fast, break things is fine in the research org, but not in the real world, right? And when it comes to many of the AI algorithms, and when we talk about fairness, bias, and these issues, I think it's important to ask, what is our experimental setup? And this is where there should be enough research done before it gets into the production.
Correct. And I will ask you a question in a second. Now, let me describe how in my group, with the 70 people, we are running about 20 projects at any point. And my expectation is only about 30% of the work that we're doing will actually ever see the light of day. Because that's why we need to be bold and we need to be willing to take that risk. And then we also measure the people differently than we do in the business units, where it's perfectly okay to so-called fail. And to me, it's not about fail, because these are all extremely smart people who are very, very capable in what they do, and they're actually producing great things. But we may learn that what we learn happens to be a negative result, namely, hey, this product is not yet ready to go to market. We'll have to put it on the shelf and maybe come back to it in 2-3 years. That's how I think about success and failure. And I don't know, NVIDIA, give me a little bit of how it works in NVIDIA.
Yeah, it's very similar, because if you see like our research org, it's so broad, right? So I'm doing AI research, there is graphics, there's of course hardware, architecture, robotics. So it's just all these different areas coming together, and it's really that convergence. Okay, AI needs to be built into all of them, but there's also the domain expertise. How do we put that together, right? And then there are many products we know they're not, there's still a lot of research to be done. For instance, robotics. We recently launched the Isaac platform, which is the platform for simulations for robotics, and then bringing it on to the real robots, right? The whole infrastructure development. But right now, there's a lot of research to be done on how AI can be adaptive and work in real robotic applications. But enabling that, right, building the infrastructure, building the platforms for research is another important aspect of this. So I was wondering, like, in the research organizations, are you also thinking of infrastructure and other development for research in addition to the product side of that development?
That's a great question. So the way I think about our group is there are two key phrases that I use. One is the work that we're doing game-changing? So it has to be that it is changing the game for the company as opposed to incremental work. Yeah. Because if it's incremental, it should be done within the business units. The second one is, I think about durable advantage. Namely, even if it is a breakthrough idea, right? Is it a durable thing, or is somebody else can easily copy this? So is that sustaining to the company's future? And since this is an AI-focused conference, I think that AI is incredibly disruptive. Mm-hmm. And it's not just an incremental change to the products, because a lot of people talk about, if you already have a product, how do I sort of somehow bring a component of AI into the mix? That's not the way we think about it. I think it's a foundational change to how the products are built in the future. So
give me an example of that.
I'll give you a very good example of that. So if you think about, it's a bit of a boring example for lots of people, so I'll go through it very quickly. Taxes. Who in the room here love to do their taxes? There's one person.
So and people exist.
That's a great exception. We need to figure out how to, I'll talk to you afterwards. Nobody wants to do their taxes except for a few people. So our job is, how do you create a smart product that actually does the taxes for you? And the way I describe our current products, not just Intuit, any company that's building a product, it's usually one size fits all. And it's built exactly the same way, and you have to figure out how to adapt yourself to use that piece of software. Now, our TurboTax product is exactly the same. The good news is it does ask you a bunch of questions, but it's got a bunch of screens that you have to go through. And it doesn't particularly recognize as yet who you are and what is your particular tax situation and what is the data that you have. Our vision is taxes are completely done. Okay? You don't have to do anything at all. And that's quite possible. Why? Because when you think about in the AI mindset way, I have to be able to access all the data that is related to you throughout the year. So I know every piece of data that is financial throughout the year. So I know what is deductible and what are the expenses that are not deductible. I know everything about your particular situation. I know about your children, how old are they, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Knowing that, and then there are 80,000 pages of tax rules, okay? So we already have the ability to take that as an expert system. We have built it. And then combine that expert system with your data and then simply say, hey, I need to get 1 or 2 pieces of data from you. Once you answer those questions, your taxes are actually done. That's the vision that we're driving to. And fundamentally, that product is very different from the current product that we have. Make sense?
Yeah. No, that's great. And that's where, that requires a research organization because it's too risky to disrupt an existing product, right? So
Correct.
You need like enough runway to see if this is
correct. Since you're also an AI person, I can give you this example, which is what we do is we actually look at the 1040 form and we NLP that form and we automatically generate the code associated with what that logic is all about is automatically done by some of the deep, in quotes, research work that we've been doing for the last 3 years. By the way, it took us about 3 years to crack that code, and it's not an easy problem to solve. And it would not have happened in the regular course of the business.
Right. And well, speaking a bit about that AI problem, right? I think having the domain data here and the deep expertise was critical, right? As opposed to just taking a general purpose NLP tool and plugging it in, right? So I assume that it had to be developed in-house.
Exactly.
And that's a related question, right? So because you could also say collaborate with universities or have external partners and try to offshore some of those research to outside entities. So what is the pros and cons of having the in-house versus?
Correct. So I think, so the framework that we use there is core and context. So the regular natural language processing of, let us say there is we also have built assistants, right? So when somebody asks a question, we actually take that question and send it to either Amazon or Google to do the first phase analysis of what is this phrase actually, what is the intent of this, because that's a straight English language processing. But we have the next stage, which is about understanding the meaning of the question in the financial world. So for example, with QuickBooks Assistant, you can ask the question, how much money did I make this month? We know what that intent is because it's a financial question. We think, oh, this is the month of October. I need to pull out what you made as revenues, right? We had to make all of those inferences, and that specific to our domain, we do. So that's core to us, and we patent those technologies and we protect them, right? But the generic ones, we look at outside people to solve for us.
Yeah, and that's a broader question too, right? What is the role of now an ecosystem? So it's not just the internal research organization. How do you function in this ecosystem, and the role of university, open source, right, other industry research organizations. Because to me, what's so special about this AI revolution as opposed to other revolutions before is the incredible openness, right? We have TensorFlow, PyTorch, MXNet, all these open source frameworks. All these big companies are releasing their code, releasing many of the models, right? And the community is moving towards, okay, how do we make it reproducible? NVIDIA is launching these containers that can run this code, whether on-prem or on the cloud. So there is all this whole ecosystem coming together to make this AI revolution happen. So what do you see the role of a research organization to build these bridges and be a social being, not just an internal-looking one?
That's an excellent one, too. So in our company, we talk about what's called outside-in thinking versus inside-out. Yeah. And that's part of me being in this conference in terms of going to various presentations, getting an immersive view of what's happening. Because AI in particular, I don't know, I heard an interesting piece of data here, by the way. There are 100 papers published per day in the world of AI.
Not surprised, even more probably.
Right. So my point is the world is changing really fast. We have to keep track of what's happening. So we build relationships with venture capitals. We build relationship with universities. We have connections with MIT and Stanford and a bunch of schools. We're going to work with Caltech,
Please
perhaps.
come to Caltech.
Yes.
Yes.
So the idea is, how do you stay connected with the external community so that you try to understand what's going on? And that way we can figure out what are the technologies that are most relevant to us, and then figure out how to adopt those. And then where we need to invent, we have to go invent. Yeah. So that's sort of the way to think about that.
It helps you move into areas that may not be the core expertise quickly and understand where the gaps are, exactly. Or even whom to hire, right? What's the right talent to hire? Because if you don't know how to evaluate in a certain area, then that already could create a lot of challenges.
Exactly right. So maybe we should, we have got about
that's what I was
less than
to say.
5 minutes to go.
Yeah.
So should we open up for questions?
Yeah. Could be on any aspects. Yeah, there we have a.
Division that I run that really they kind of want to go hire PhD students from their favorite professors, which I resist. But nonetheless, how do you figure out that the people that you need in a research organization?
So before we can answer, I'm curious why you resist that.
I guess my view is for bringing generic technology out of universities, it's great, right? But for bringing or generic techniques out of university, it's great. For bringing industry context for how to use it in a meaningful way in industry, it's sort of really hard to get any kind of good answers out of PhD students.
Correct. So I think that's the reason why I was talking about diversity of talent. So if you look at my group, we have, so if you just look at me, for example, so I have a PhD. For a bunch of years, I hid the fact that I had a PhD, by the way. As I was responsible for building products and shipping them to market, I did not tell anybody that I have a PhD. But the point there is, I think everybody goes through their journey line with respect to their experience. And what we look for is a blending of those. So we have a bunch of PhDs in the group, but that's actually, out of the 70 people, maybe about 10 of them have PhDs, but there are the other 60 who don't have PhDs. But in fact, I mentioned design, I mentioned product. So these are talented people who actually have spent time in the business, but naturally tend to have that sense of, I'm an adventurous person, I'm not satisfied with the day-to-day shipping of the product, I'm very interested in exploring. And you're absolutely right, we need people who have actually done that to blend that with the PhDs, to actually bring that sense of theory and reality so that we can actually create the products that we want to create.
Yeah. And what I would like to add is, again, how much deep do you want them to go in terms of like developing new AI techniques, or this is really an extremely challenging AI problem, right? For instance, if you want to make a robot smart, we don't know that today. That requires the deep expertise. Versus, say, more in the applied domain, they take all these developments that are happening out in the open source, but they can intelligently process that, understand that, and develop it into the product. So I think understanding what the requirements are is the first step. And the second one is really the personality, right? There are a lot of PhDs I know who have gone into so many different disciplines, very diverse disciplines after that. And many of them are itching to do a lot of real world things, and so it's really picking out the right mix.
Sorry to dominate the conversation, but the mix between experience and experience in the business units and outside in thinking, how do you guys in your organization, each of you differently, figure that out?
So I think the way to think about that is, if you look at the problems that we're trying to solve, there is a diversity of problems. So just to give a concrete example, and I think Anima actually referenced sort of the two different types of problems that you might be solving, even in the world of AI, right? So we've got people who are engineers who are smart enough to understand the advances in AI and pick a problem and say, hey, I think that particular solution that is already built, it's open source, it's available, all I need to do is take that algorithm, plug it in, and try it out, and if it works, it's brilliant. So they may not know the inner workings of the algorithm, but they're able to actually use it. So we have people like that in my group. But we also have people who are foundational AI thinkers who actually are capable of inventing new algorithms. So there is a blending of that. And then I also have pure engineers, by the way, who actually build the infrastructure surrounding it. And Anima referred to that as, hey, are you also doing infrastructure research? Sometimes we have to do some advanced infrastructure thinking in order to go deploy something. So we do that as well, and we need that. And then since we actually experiment with customers, a lot of this has customer interfaces with respect to how we interact. So we are thinking about sort of foundationally, what does that next generation experience looks like? As you know, we have grown up in the world of 2D interfaces. What's happening with voice is actually, it is a zero dimension. So it has no visual anything. And all of the communication happens through the nuances of the pacing, the emotion that you inject into your voice. We're studying all of that, by the way, in terms of how to deliver conversations that have that kind of human nuance built into that. And that's still a research area, by the way, because by no means it's a solved problem.
It's great. We are out of time, but I encourage you to chat after this event. And thank you so much, Bharath, for
Thank you, Anima.
sharing your experience.
Great knowing you, too.
Yes, thank you.